Thank you very much for playing. So that is my point to you that we think of contracts as these big, ugly 10-page, 30-page documents you get, when you buy a house, or when you rent a car, or when you download your latest iTunes song. There's like a 60-page contract that you have to agree to, and allegedly you're reading it on your little cell phone as you're interpreting everything. And contracts don't have to be that way. Contracts are just me and you coming to an agreement. And let me just break down the three elements to a contract. Okay. Let's see. There's an exchange of promises, and these are in the form of an offer and an acceptance. And I'm not going to get too technical with all this stuff, but basically, one person makes an offer, another person accepts it. If one person makes an offer and the other person doesn't accept it, and the other person says, wait, what about this? So, you saw that we were negotiating. Then when she offered me for $5, she made me a new offer. And then I could have accepted it, but I didn't have $5. So I made her an offer. So you see, each of those was an offer, and only when we had a deal was there an acceptance. The other thing is consideration, which is a complicated word for something of value. The pen was valuable, the $3 was valuable. And so offer, acceptance, consideration, that's what makes a contract. So when somebody calls you and says, hey, I want a photo of the board meeting, and you say, okay, I charge $75, $150, $300, and they say, okay, we'll do it. That's a contract. And the reason you need to know that is because if they come around later and try to change the deal, you've already got a contract, right? And so you don't have to accept a change in the deal later when you've already got the deal in place. So this happens a lot to photographers, and it's happened to me a bunch of times, and it was like the most enjoyable thing after I went to law school. And I had actually had an assignment with a newspaper. They wanted me to go shoot something for them, whatever. I made an agreement. I actually sent them my written contract. They signed it, sent it back to me. I did the work, Came time for them to pay the bill, and they said, you know what, you need to sign this contract before we can pay you. And this contract gave them additional rights than what I had already given them. This is after I had shot the assignment, after I had delivered the assignment, after they had run the photos. So I'm sure you can imagine the conversation. I basically said, I'm sorry, we already had a deal, we already had an agreement, you're bound by that agreement, I'm not going to sign this other agreement. At which point they said, well, if you ever want to work for us in the future, blah, blah, blah. I said, I just want my money. So just telling you that because that's something that happens a lot, especially when you're first starting out, where people will do this like bait and switch, and I think it's kind of a scam. I also like to think that they don't realize that they're trying to scam you, they're just doing their job. But nevertheless, it can be intimidating for somebody to tell you, I'm not going to pay you unless you do this. But the reality is that you have a contract in place. So that's the basic thing related to getting the assignment that I want you to remember. The second phase is the phase that we're probably going to end up talking most about today, which is the assignment, or collecting the information, doing the reporting. The first thing I want you to remember is that we do have some special rights as journalists, mostly related to confidential sources. However, in general, what you should remember is being a journalist doesn't give you any more rights than being a citizen. Luckily, we have a lot of rights as a citizen, but there's no greater access level just because you're a journalist. Everything that you have access to, your next door neighbor has access to, just the same. So while people will often, especially government agencies, will afford you extra privileges, that's not a right. It's just something they do because it makes everyone work together better, and it's a nice way to do business. And you guys have to do business with various agencies and the city and the school, of course. So it's in their interest to smooth that relationship out and make it easier most of the time. So that's why you'll have public information officers and that kind of stuff. But for example, if you were doing a story on a murder that happened in the house next door to me in my neighborhood in North San Antonio, you could go up and knock on the door, but you can't trespass. If I tell you, let's say you were canvassing the neighborhood, because everyone goes and asks the neighbors, what was he like? He's the mass murderer, and the neighbors always say, oh, he was such a nice guy. So you can come up and knock on my door, but then if I tell you to leave, you have to leave. The fact that you're a journalist doesn't mean that you can actually be on my property. In fact, there have been cases where police let journalists come along and on a raid or something like that, and it was considered to be an invasion of privacy for the people who were raided, because the police had a warrant to go into the house. The warrant did not include the right to bring journalists along. So it's something to keep in mind. As a journalist, we try to get as much access as we can get, and we talk our way in and argue about it later. And I'm not going to tell you not to do that, because that's kind of the way it's done. but just keep in mind that trespassing laws apply to you, and that includes malls. A lot of people think malls are public places, but they're private entities. They're privately owned. So if you go to a mall and the mall people tell you you can't be here, or I need you to go through this process, you need to go through that process. Doesn't apply to a city council meeting. Doesn't apply to the park. There's some basic public, sort of the quintessential public forums, they're called. And these are places you should never be kicked out of. Parks, sidewalks, those are really the classic public forum. And the reason that that's considered the classic public forum is that's where our society traditionally has exchanged information. So, in the colonial days, they would gather on the Boston Commons and, argue about politics and whatever. And so that's the classic public forum. In fact, there was a case in Boston, in the last couple years, and the ruling just came out this spring. A guy was basically using his cell phone to videotape a police officer arresting somebody in the Boston Commons. And they have very strict wiretap laws in Massachusetts. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But what I'm trying to tell you now is that he was arrested for videotaping the police activity in Boston Commons. And the judge had a field day with just going on about how this is the quintessential, this is like the heart of our nation's democracy and public forum, and Boston Commons, and you cannot restrict photography in Boston Commons, because that would just throw everything that we've worked for and for the last, however old our nation is, out the window. I guess 240 years or whatever. So that was a problem. But I mean, the point being that he was arrested, and then the judge basically said, this is never okay, because it was a park. The other, but it brings to mind another issue that I want you to be aware of, and that is the wiretapping laws. This has been in the news a lot lately. In the last few years, and again, it's kind of related to this Boston Commons thing. What's happened is that because everyone's using their cell phones to document everything. Used to be that only photojournalists were harassed by cops for taking pictures, but now everybody's taking pictures and everybody's being given a hard time. And some bright police officers figured out that there's wiretapping laws. Does everyone know what a wiretapping law does?
Restrict, I guess, the access to traffic.
Yeah, well, that's what it was intended to do. It's to protect private communication. And there's something called two-party consent and one-party consent. But in some states, in order to record a conversation, you need the consent of both parties. So I can't just walk in with a recorder when I'm having a chat with Tricia and start recording. I need to ask her. Texas is not one of those states. Texas is a one-party state. So you can record a conversation in Texas if you're in it and you consent. And in fact, we had an interesting case we studied in my family law class where one of the parents was allowed to consent on behalf of the child, and so the child had conversations with the other parent. You know, they were in a divorce, and so they recorded the conversations with the parent and the child because the other parent consented on behalf of the child. So Texas has very liberal laws. It's not really a problem for us, but it's something to be aware of that this is going on. But so what's been going on is police officers have been arresting people for videotaping their arrests, and they're using the wiretapping laws. These are in just 3 states: Illinois, Maryland, and Massachusetts. Because those are two-party consent, and the police officers weren't consenting, they were arresting them on violation of wiretapping laws for videotaping police officers' arrests. Now, what we've been getting over the last couple of years, as these cases have gone up in the court system, is rulings that say that that a police officer has no expectation of privacy while he's doing his job, and so all these cases are being thrown out. So I don't want you to be too worried about it, but it's just good trivia, I guess. The other access issue is open meetings, and I know that's a big part of what you guys are dealing with right now. So yes.
I had a question about the wiretapping law. I remember reading a story about that. I forgot, it was a man who had taken a picture of his son being arrested, and I think it was in one of these states. And the police arrested the father for taking the photos, and I think that the wiretapping law stated that he could be in prison for something like 25 years, something crazy like that. And I mean, a lot of his income went into defending himself, and I mean, they went into all kinds of debt. It finally was thrown out, but I mean, they basically tortured him and his family.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, I think that people need to realize that too, even though that they're throwing them out,
yeah,
they can torture you for a while and take your money.
That's true. And legal fees are not cheap. And it's these things do drag out, and sometimes it takes an upper level appellate court to throw it out, and in those cases, it's just $100,000 down the road,
Yeah, and this man had never done anything in his life, and now he's facing 25 years in prison.
Yeah, and I mean, when you compare it to the prison sentences for some other crimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like 2 questions. Like for something like that, could you end up like sewing them back for making you go back, be going through all that?
Yes.
The other question I have though is as far as in Texas, the one-sided part, because again, I work in a retail store, and we can record video, but we can't record audio for some reason. I don't know what that has to do with anything.
Well, there's probably no law that says you can't record the audio, but maybe they're concerned about privacy issues. So I mean, you'd have to ask them the reason behind it.
Maybe just information, verbally.
Yeah, and I think some people, if it's a national store, they may just say, we got one policy for the whole system, but there would be nothing wrong with recording. To my knowledge, there would be nothing wrong with recording the audio as well.
As far as the one with the
then would the son be a second party consenting to this?
Yeah, but it would be an all parties would need to consent, yeah. So you can't just have like two people in the room, agree, and so.
In reference to police not being able to stop you from recording, what are they allowed to do to, I guess, I mean, are they allowed to block the cameras or?
No, what they are allowed to do is create, you know, a reasonable zone around the crime scene. So you're not allowed to interfere with the crime scene. You're not allowed to interfere with activity like emergency medical activity. And they're allowed to sort of create a perimeter to keep all that stuff, to keep the integrity of all that stuff. But they're not allowed to just continue to push you back and back and back. And actually, you know what? I have a video I can show you. If, what's his name? Can you like search for the YouTube video of Long Island
Yeah, I did.
and I'll show you. You'll kind of.
Hey, while she's doing that, can I ask you another question about, you said earlier, street and sidewalk. I'm sorry, you said public sidewalk,
Yes.
parks. There was a case in, I want to say it's 2008, of a guy standing on a sidewalk outside a hotel where big Democratic donors
Yeah.
were having a meeting. And a cop pushed him off the sidewalk, pushed him into the street, and then arrested him for obstructing traffic.
Yeah.
So the street is, I mean, does it qualify
Oh
as
yeah,
a
the
sidewalk?
street also. I should have
or
put that on the list. Streets also.
As long as you're not obstructing traffic?
However, you're not allowed to just obstruct traffic. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's usually where they get you. I mean, to me, that's assault. You know, I would have sued that cop for assault, or consider it. You know. It's actually not as easy to sue somebody as you think. So.
Well, there was video of all this.
I find it.
We're going through the act.
Okay.
I have another question on public forums. Since we're a public institution, is the whole campus a public forum, and particularly the student center, which still has signs that say you may be asked to show your student ID if you're in the student center?
Yeah, in my opinion, it's public. And I wouldn't want to be shown something like in the policies or rules that would say otherwise. Because it's a public institution. Now, you can't like say, oh, this is a city building, so I can walk into the mayor's office anytime I want because it's a public place, right? No. So private offices, you know, but areas that are open to the public, and they use a phrase called sort of like designated for public discussion and open for public discussion. Places that are actually designated as places for the interchange of information are especially protected. So
This one?
yeah, this one. So this is a really fun, if you like to get your blood boiling, video. So this is the cop telling the videographer.
Just go away. I don't care where you go. Go away. Go away. Go away. Give me this. What's your name? Philip?
See, there's a crime scene back here. We don't know what it is.
Because I want you to go away and not stand here and argue with me. Otherwise, you're about to get locked up. Away. All right? Leave. Leave. No, leave. Leave, because it's a current investigation and you're leaving. That's why. All right? You're going away. Because it's an active scene and you're leaving. All right? No place. Go away. No.
people. You can see, where's,
Yeah.
see that guy?
Yeah.
And he's not telling them to leave.
No. That's what I mean when I say you have the same rights as other people. So you can never be, if the public is allowed somewhere, if the neighbors are allowed to be looky-loos, you can't be kicked out of that spot. Which is not to say that it doesn't happen.
You understand? I've been doing this for 30 years. There's nothing you can hold over my head or anybody out there. Go away.
He's about to find out what can be held over.
No.
I'm going to arrest you. Sycamore Avenue.
People.
This is the same scene.
Yeah, the same video. Same thing.
I told PIL
See
to
how
come
the
and go back to the
Put it down. Put it down. Put it down. Put it down. You're under arrest. Get out of here.
See how far he had moved away?
Wow.
Even that was unreasonable, and the cops still just came and arrested him. Obviously, somebody was having a bad day. Then somebody else was having a bad day. So I just want you to see that to realize that I don't know how this works. These things do happen, and it's not just because you're right and in the right doesn't mean that something like this isn't going to happen to you. This photographer did all the right stuff. He tried to speak calmly to the officer. He obeyed his requests, even though they were unreasonable, because he knew that if he got thrown in jail, he wouldn't make his deadline. And that's something you always have to keep in mind is, you know, am I going to fight this? Well, what are the consequences? You always have to think about the consequences. He did not get self-righteous. He just, you know, is calm, and it's very easy to get defensive and self-righteous when you're in this situation. And the first few times I did, I probably was like, ah, you know. But calm. You got to be calm. And it's really good to think through what you'll do when this happens, because every journalist I know has had something like this happen to them, not as extreme, but certainly the first part where we're pushed away and told you can't be here. But look, that person's over there. I can stand next to them. If they can stand there, I can stand. No, you have to go to. Yeah. And so, something I want each of you to think about is when you're in that situation, what are you going to do? How are you going to react? How are you going to keep yourself from getting arrested? Get your story, but do your job. And sometimes, in order to do your job, you have to assert your rights. Public access. This I got from the Attorney General last week. I called them and I said, can you send me a copy of the Open Meetings Handbook and the Public Information Handbook? And it was in my mailbox 3 days later. So I would recommend all of you call and order this because it's free and they'll send it to you. And then you have something that you can turn to. It's got great information about, you know, what is a public meeting, the notice requirements.
Where did you get that?
The Attorney General's office. And if you search, if you Google Texas Attorney General Public Information Handbook, there should be some, pull it up. There should be something on there about how to order it, how to ask for it. And you really want both because actually there's different rules and remedies. So if you're trying to get public information and you're running into a wall, this is where you want to turn to. If you're trying to get numbers or statistics or the minutes of a meeting, these are the guidelines that can help you. And actually, if you're being stonewalled, right, under the Public Information Act, the Attorney General's office is actually where you go to seek your remedy. So an important thing that both of these books have is information on how to solve your problem. So when you're not getting the response you need from the public official, where do you go? Who do you talk to? Well, if it's public information, it's the Attorney General. Completely different rules for open meetings as far as where you go to assert your rights. And I was telling Irene earlier that the, it says in here somewhere, and I'm trying to find the page. I'm not sure. But from what I read in here, I read the online version, which I think there's a 2011 PDF online, actually. So if you want to just read the PDF, I personally like having something I can touch and underline and tab and stuff like that. So, but basically, the person you go to when you're having trouble with public meetings is the county attorney, actually. So you would find out who the county attorney here is and call them, and it's their job to help you. What? No, the Attorney General. The State Attorney General. So, public information, Attorney General, open meetings. I think it might be in the 2011 PDF. I'm going to find it though, and I'm going to make sure that y'all get it through Irene. Trying to think about other issues related to collecting the news. Let me just briefly go over the issues you need to worry about in publishing, so then I can open it up and we can have more of a exchange.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes.
On the campus? So if someone puts in place a policy, for example, saying you have to ask permission to take photos in the student center, which this is not a policy, but
Let's say they did
before, is that's in violation, right? Because this is obviously a public.
Yeah, I would think it would be. There have been cases where they found that even though a meeting is open, you know, an organization or an agency or whatever can have a policy that there's no pictures allowed or no video allowed. But as far as the student center, I think you could probably challenge that with some luck. But the way to do that, when you get the policy, when they enact a policy like that, the way to challenge it is not to just start doing it and wait to get thrown out for trespassing or arrested or whatever. The way to do that is to challenge the policy itself. And keep an eye out, because new policies have, you can't just make a new policy, right? There's a whole administrative procedure they have to go through to make these policies. And so there should be notice, and they should notify people that would be affected. And so you would challenge it, hopefully before it ever was enacted, but then if it was enacted. We're challenging right now a policy in Washington, D.C. It's a very antique policy, but it's basically, you can't, you need a permit in order to take pictures for profit. I'm summarizing, you know, but, and basically if you are in the business of photography, you need a permit in our nation's capital, you know, parks and stuff. You know, it's ridiculous. And it's geared to, they have similar laws actually in San Antonio, where it's geared to the people who come up to you on the street and say, let me take your picture in front of the Alamo and I'll sell it to you for $5. And so, again, like I say, just because we're journalists doesn't mean other laws don't apply to us. All the laws do apply to us. But those laws are really geared towards vendors. And I had a situation in Dripping Springs a few months ago where they were treating the journalists like vendors and demanding that they had permits to take pictures at public events. And I had to sort of set them straight. And, you know, there were people that were saying one thing and then somebody said, that person never said that. And, you know, bottom line was I got them to realize and agree that you don't need a permit to do journalism. So even though there may be a permit for being a vendor photographer who like sets up a tent and takes pictures and sells them to people. Now when we start selling our journalistic pictures online, it gets really muddy. And there have been a lot of problems with that around the country, especially with sporting events. And that's just like a whole nother issue. It'll take me a year to talk
I
about.
know, like here we have a big issue with weddings. People wanting their wedding photos to be in a public place that happens to be beautiful, but then you have to have a permit, like you have to pay like $100 in order to get your wedding photo done or your kids, you know, I don't know, prom or quinceanera or whatever it is.
Yeah, what's the location?
I know that you have to pay for, but maybe this is not public, you have to pay for the missions.
The
Shouldn't
missions
have
though, you
paid.
can,
Cause I,
you can
yeah.
get them one, like because I've shot there so many times, you can get like a 1-day pass for free.
Yeah.
But you still gotta, but it,
I've never
Still
had to
gonna
pay
get
to
it.
shoot there.
really?
I've gone to the
Cause I
mission.
think
I've
you
shot
have to
portraits in the missions. and
Because I
it
know
really
it's
never bothered
$50,
me.
but if you go to the campus or the park police station that's right there
Yeah.
outside the missions, and you just explain to them what you're doing, and you make it seem like it's not a huge deal,
Yeah.
they'll give you a 1-day pass for free.
Yeah, and our argument at NPPA, this is what I've been pushing for as long as these have been issues, is that the requirement for a permit should be related to the level of disruption. In other words, if I'm bringing in a crew and setting up a bunch of lights and, you know, blocking traffic and sidewalks and interfering with other people's use of the park, then I should need a permit for that. If I'm going to be going off the reservation and, you know, doing other stuff, I should need a permit for that. If I, you know, so we ask them to require the permit based on the activity, not based on what's being done. What a lot of them will do is say, well, if it's for journalism, you don't need a permit. But if it's for commercial work, you know, if you're going to be selling the picture,
Right.
well, I sell the picture for journalism.
Right,
Plus,
right.
if I really like it, if it's a good picture, I'm going to sell prints, you know.
Right.
Probably not going to sell many because nobody buys them anymore. But the point is that, you know, that's really nebulous, you know, what you're going to do with the picture. And if I'm shooting a portrait of a historical figure at the mission for the newspaper or a band, I shot pictures of bands for newspapers at the San Jose mission, you know, I shouldn't need a permit. And if I'm shooting a senior portrait at the mission, I shouldn't need a permit. That's my philosophy. The national parks is actually a really messy thing. We've gone to Congress and testified about how bad the permitting system is in the national parks because every park seems to have a different policy, and so there have been some efforts to try to nationalize photo permitting policies in national parks, but
And just a question too, what about the Alamo? Because I know those photos there, they consider them property, right?
well, in my opinion, the daughters are really in the wrong. What they have told me is that if, you know, obviously anyone can walk up to the Alamo and start taking pictures of it.
Right.
Right, but if they
You
think
can't
you're,
sell that photo or, yeah.
I think you can. They will tell you that you can't. They will tell you, if they think you're a professional photographer, they will tell you that you can't do it without a permit from the daughters. And I think they're wrong because it belongs to the people.
Yeah, it's a national icon.
Yeah, not only is it a national park, but it's the property of the state of Texas, even though it's managed by the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. And so, in my opinion, they're way off base, and it's sort of on my bucket list someday to pick that fight. You know, but they will give you a hard time.
What about places like the McNay?
The McNay is private property,
Is it?
and you do have to pay a fee. It's $10, I think, to bring. I've done it too. It's a beautiful place though, and it's worth it. My portrait clients are like,
What
okay,
about
okay.
hotels? Because I know I've tried to shoot at a hotel in Lake Garden before.
Uh-huh.
And they wanted to, I don't know if they had talked about it before, but they came up with some absurd price. It was like $250 for a permit to shoot for an hour.
Wow.
I was like, I'm not even getting paid that much to shoot for an hour.
Yeah, I mean, that's private property, so they can do whatever they want, really. You know, these hotels that abut the Riverwalk, you know, once you're on the Riverwalk, they can't say anything. But if you're on their property, yeah, it's up to them. real quick, publishing. First, one thing I want you to remember is copyright. Okay, a lot of people misunderstand copyright. Copyright is created the moment the creative work is created. So if you're a photographer, the minute you push the button, that copyright is in place. You own the copyright to that picture. You can register your copyright, and that helps you if it's ever infringed, and I highly recommend that you investigate learning how to handle your copyright registration. Same thing goes for your articles. There's something called a work for hire. So you generally, as independent people, own your work. Everything you do and create, you own it. When you go work for somebody as an employee, they own your work because they're considered the author. So the easy way to remember it is, sorry. So the easy way to remember it is, the owner of the copyright equals the author, okay? So then you have to ask yourself, who's the author, right? If I'm independent, it's me, okay? It might be a corporation. There's two ways a corporation can own your copyright, okay? One is a work for hire. Let me write that here because it's an important phrase. And the other is if you transfer it. So you can sell your copyright to a corporation, okay? But the work for hire comes into play in two ways. You're an employee, or by a work for hire agreement, which are basically a contract that says, even though I'm not an employee and I'm not getting health insurance and I'm not getting a salary and I'm never going to see you again, we'll consider this a work for hire. You get all the rights that you would have as if I was an employee. So, but a work for hire agreement has to be in writing and signed. And a copyright transfer has to be in writing and signed. And I tell you this because what I want you to take away from this is not this complicated chart that I've made, but that you own the copyright to your work unless there's something signed that says you've given it to someone else, okay? Or you're an employee. So if you're an employee, you're certainly making minimum wage, if nothing else, and getting health insurance and being treated like an employee, so you'll know if you're an employee, right? There may be some situations where you're not clear and there's a whole evaluation, but basically either you're an employee or you've signed something. If you haven't signed something and you're not an employee, you own the copyright. End of story. It's that simple. People think copyright is really complicated, and it can get really complicated, and I could talk for 3 hours about complicated copyright issues, but that's the core of it, okay? You own it unless you give it away in writing, or you're an employee. The other thing you need to be aware of is libel. Someone tell me what libel is. Defamation.
Where you willingly or with purpose divulge false information and explanation to the public. And then someone's identified as being falsely accused, and then they come back with either proof of that false information or what's the other? That's a lot. But basically false information published.
Yeah. There's for it to be defamation, first of all, it has to be published. I guess slander is spoken. but we're mostly dealing with the stuff in writing. It has to be defamatory, which means it has to be negative, and it has to be false. So these three things will protect you if you avoid them. By not publishing or speaking to anyone, by not telling lies to other people. You can tell lies to yourself all you want, but not to other people. And then it has to be defamatory. So what does that mean? If I say Irene is won Neighbor of the Year, right? That's a lie. But is it defamatory? No. If I say Irene won the Pulitzer Prize, is that defamatory? No. Okay. If I say Irene did an expose on Trisha and exposed Trisha's criminal activity,
Why are you trying to
that's a lie, right? And
Is it?
well, is it? I don't know. Okay, and that's actually a lie as to both of them, right? And is it defamatory?
It depends on whether she loses her job or not.
Well, it's still negative. It casts her in a negative light. And so whether she loses her job or not, I've accused her of a crime, and it's damaging. But the other thing is it has to be false. And so if you avoid false, if you verify your facts, you're probably okay. Because if it's true.
I have a question. Because I thought defamatory was one, of course you hurt the person's reputation and that kind of thing, but it had to be measurable, like in dollars and cents.
Well, there are actually two kinds of defamation, right? One is sort of like straight up defamation. In that case, there have to be damages. That's an element of defamation.
How they measure that is it causes them to be shunned, basically.
Okay.
Well, and if you lost your job, that's a measurable, then you have damages. But there's something called defamation per se, which if I say Irene committed a crime, Irene the murderer, that's just like the courts have decided, you don't have to give me evidence that you lost money for that, for me to believe that that's damaging, because you're accusing her of a crime. So you're right.
But then why don't more people use that? Like for those people who are accused of murdering their child and then we find out that it's somebody else. But you never hear about them going back and saying, I'm suing the police because of X, Y, Z.
Well, the police are protected in, their activity of, there's actually a lot of privileges related to defamation, and including for journalists. If you accurately report an allegation, that is not defamation. That's not actionable as defamation. Okay. So if you say the police have alleged that this person did this, you're just accurately reporting allegations. And actually, that's true. The police did allege that.
Right, I didn't say they did it.
So the truth is always a defense to defamation.
Okay.
And there's that privilege of accurately reporting allegations. How am I doing?
You're doing great. I have a little quick one.
Oh, okay.
I'm
I just,
sorry.
how much time do I have left?
10 more minutes. 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes.
Okay.
The third part,
The third part.
defamation.
She said it was false information.
That's right, false. Yes. And if somebody sues you for defamation, it's their responsibility to prove that it was false. So it's not your responsibility as the person who got sued to prove that it's true. However, if you can prove that it's true, you'll save yourself a lot of trouble. Having evidence of the truth of what you're writing is very useful. But don't feel like you need to get concrete proof of everything you put in writing. As long as you have good verification that it's true. So those are like the big issues that I want you to remember, and I want to spend the rest of the time with questions about your issues. So
I have a question about like contracts, and in Texas, like a lot of people, like some businessmen, like won't sign a contract. Like say it's like two companies working together, you just like do it on a handshake. I mean, like, how do you prove that there was ever a deal?
Well, that's why you like to have it in writing.
Right.
It's easier to prove. You can prove that you have an agreement by evidence that you performed it. So, you know, you have this handshake agreement, and then, you know, you're trying to prove that you have this agreement. Well, something that might be evidence of that would be, well, look, you know, we had an agreement that I would fix his fence, and I fixed his fence. That's pretty good evidence that I did it. And he let me on the property, and oh yeah, and I borrowed his hammer, you know, and so that's all pretty good evidence that you had an agreement. But that's why we like to have contracts in writing. And I'll tell you that for every assignment that I have, for every photo assignment that I take, I have an agreement in writing. I do that because for two reasons, right? One is because if I ever have to prove that you know, the person owes me what we agreed on, I'll have that proof. But the other reason is because I want to make sure that my client and I are on the same page, because I like my clients, I want to keep my clients, and so the best way to maintain a good relationship with your clients is to have everything in writing and make sure that you're both in agreement. And a contract is a great way to do that. It doesn't have to be a big scary contract. It can be, you know, okay, we're agreeing to this. Bullet point 1, bullet point 2, bullet point 3. Let me know if you agree. And they write back, we agree. You know, that's a contract. That would be good evidence of your agreements. Yeah.
What do you think is the biggest issue that photojournalists face?
You mean besides making a living?
Yeah.
Copyright. I think copyright's the biggest issue that photographers face. Because even though your copyright is so strongly in place, it's very, very hard to protect at the moment. You have to go to federal court to sue somebody for copyright violation. And if you haven't pre-registered, you're not going to get attorney's fees. So you may spend, you know, $20,000 on attorney's fees just to get the person to pay you $500. So it doesn't really balance. There's actually been some talk about creating a copyright small claims court, and I'm hopeful that that will be a useful tool for photographers.
I have a question about when you say establishing a copyright for your photos. Is there like a batch process where an entire shoot can be copyrighted under one?
You mean
instance? Registered? Or does each individual photo have to go through?
No, you can group register your work, and actually you can, if you wanted to go back and register everything you shot in 2010, you can do that as a group registration. And that's really the only way to do it as a photographer, because, but the trick is that you have to register the published work and the unpublished work separately, and it's very intimidating, really. But it's just a matter of reading through
And then also, what if you have a contract where you're assigned to do a specific job, like say that it's an illustration, and it's like a business worker with a bag and a business suit, and to illustrate a point for a client, and you come back with images that they don't like, and so they cancel the contract, or they pay you that half fee for not following through, the kill fee. And then they go back and use a different photographer with the exact same imagery, slightly different. Do you have any rights for copyright or for intellectual property to say, well, this was my idea specifically, and they went and got someone cheaper or brought in somebody different and it's slightly different to use that image instead versus mine that they would have paid for? Does that
There might be
make
two
sense?
issues there, right? One would be whether they broke your contract because they, you know, killed your work, even though they did somebody else, they accepted very similar work, you know, and that's not really a valid reason to kill your assignment. And so I would think they probably breached my contract. And then it's very hard to win a copyright claim against another photographer for copying your idea. And people have tried, but in general, really art is all copying other art. You know, it's inspired by other art. And so unless you're really like to the letter, you know, trying to identically recreate a work, you're probably not gonna, if you just have the same idea, like, you know, I shot the mayor from the pool balcony at the Hyatt, and you shoot the mayor from the pool balcony at the Hyatt. It's not a copyright violation. That's sort of an idea you know, you're stealing my idea. And that's something you need to remember about copyright is there's no copyright on ideas, right? It's just the expression of the idea. So the photograph is the expression of the idea. The article is the expression of the idea. Your blog post, the expression of your idea. So somebody can't lift your whole blog post or your whole article or your whole photograph, but they can copy your idea. They can say, you know, you know, there's a really interesting concept here, and, you know, write a very similar article as long as it's not word for word. And they can do the same thing with yours.
So does that also include, let's say, if it's technically challenging to produce that photo, let's say it's staged with specific objects and inline, and there was more than just a snapshot or more than a candid, and it's something that I guess the signature to your work, is something that you're known for. If somebody goes and does the exact same thing, that's still just using an idea versus
I think it probably would be. I mean, I'd have to see a specific example, and the reality is so many of these legal issues, yeah, it'd be hard to prove, and a lot of legal issues are actually quite nebulous, you know. I mean, you've got your black and whites a lot of times, but some of the stuff that's kind of in the middle, you know, you may not get an answer until you take it to court and get a ruling and have a jury and go to the appellate system, and, you know, I mean, it's like, okay, how much do you want to spend to prove this? It's kind of unfortunate that we can't just get straight answers sometimes, but that's sort of the nature of the law.
I have a commercial photography instructor, Scott Balance, and he's always in court, it seems like, over copyright stuff.
Is he?
Yeah.
I need to meet him.
Yeah, always in court with something.
Good.
But for the most part, it seems like he lets things go. Like, people will grab his stuff off the internet all the time, but he lets it go if they're not making money off of it, or they haven't made enough money off of it yet for him to, like, say, give me some.
Yeah.
What are we doing about, like, the internet, as far as, because people can take anything?
They technically have the ability to take it, but it's a copyright violation. So just because it's on the internet, and that's a misconception a lot of people walk out of college with, and I see it in newsrooms, and I see it, you know, businesses, whatever. A lot of people think if it's on the internet, I can grab it and I can use it. It's free. It's just not true. Unless you put it up there with like a Creative Commons license, which is sort of this license that says I agree that people may reuse. You know, if you assert that people can reuse it, then they can reuse it. But in general, no. And probably for him, he's more interested in just going after people that he can really get money from. Because if I'm suing like a housewife who's doing a blog, you know, not only does it make me look kind of mean, but it, I may not get that much money from her.
Well, he said it is a two-edged sword in some aspects of it. If they're using his stuff on the internet, he's getting, because he always has his branding on his photos. So he's getting some kind of recognition because other people are seeing it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of advertising. But then when larger corporations take it and they don't, you know, they don't give him anything for it, and they're clearly making money, then that's when he has a big issue.
Yeah, and I can definitely see. I mean, there's a strategy to all of this stuff, and you really have to just think about: do I want to pursue this? Do I not? Is it worth my trouble, or is it going to make me?
And it costs him money. I mean, he has. I think he's won a few, but it costs him money to do this.
Yeah.
But then he only does it when he knows that he can prove within a shadow of a doubt that, you know, this is wrong.
Yeah.
What about Facebook? Because I know if you publish your work on Facebook, you have to, when you sign up for a account account, it says whatever you put on there, they can reproduce if you choose to say.
Yeah, like they.
Yeah, there are terms and conditions to Facebook and also Twitter. Actually, Twitter's terms and conditions are way worse than Facebook. And let me just say, first of all, Facebook changes their terms like every 5 minutes, and so I'm not up to date on the latest version, but what I understand it to be is basically you're giving them a license that they can use the photos and people can, you know, share your photos because that's the way Facebook works. And but that if you ever want to stop that, and that permission stops when you take the photo off. And to me, that's acceptable because I want to participate in Facebook. I like what it does, and when I read something like that, I think, okay, what do they really need in order to do what they're doing to provide me with a service? And I feel like that's pretty close to what they need. Not everyone agrees with me.
So if I just deleted like a bunch of photos on Facebook and it stopped floating around later, it'd be like.
Yeah, there may be something on there now that like says if somebody's already shared it and then you take it off, it's maybe still there. Mechanically, I don't know how that works, but yeah, it's, to me that's like if you can get out of that, I'm okay with that. Twitter has this, you know, they've got their new picture service where, and who's the other? Was it TwitPic maybe? One of these companies had a thing that basically said, whatever you post on here, we can also relicense. And then they made a deal with a photo agency to distribute pictures that were posted on TwitPic. And I'm not sure if it was TwitPic or not. I might maybe slandering somebody.
So they could use your stuff for stock photography
so they could,
and make money.
Yes, and not pay you. And that's when I was like, you know, actually did a blog post about it. I think it was TwitPic. And a lot of celebrities were posting photos on TwitPic, like Ellen DeGeneres was doing that. And then they found out that they had made this deal with this picture agency, and she just said, I'm dumping them. And everyone else was like, I'm dumping them, I'm dumping them. And there's other ways, like YFrog, I think, will post your photos on Twitter, and they don't demand such rights. So there's alternatives out there.
Is there a major difference between shooting video and video laws and photography laws?
The only major difference is that with video you're collecting audio, and so the wiretap laws come into place. So these wiretap laws, if you're shooting video and you're not recording audio, not an issue. But if you're shooting video and you're collecting audio, wiretap laws do come into play. That's the real primary difference. The other difference may be, it would be possible, well, I don't know about that. Yeah, I'll just stick with that answer.
So that means like in those 3 states that you talked to us about, if it was just photography, it wouldn't have been an issue.
Not an issue, yeah. And so it's kind of a misconception to say that they were arrested for the videotaping, because really they were arresting for the audio. Yeah. Wow. So that's audio.
Online, I know a lot of those photos are usually not really private. Like I know there's been like stuff on the news like a while back about like sometimes the like a military wife will send a photo to their husband's personal page, and sometimes that stuff ends up getting big on their like new photos and stuff.
They get spread all over the place because they click the wrong button, like Anthony Weiner. Yeah. You know, he thought he was sending a private photo of his crotch to somebody, and he ended up putting it on Twitter. And, you know, I mean, actually, there's an exception to copyright that, as journalists, you should be aware of, but it's called fair use. And so, let's talk about the Anthony Weiner scandal. You know, he, first of all, was blessed with a really unfortunate name, and then he does this really unfortunate thing. So that picture, right, he took it. So he owns the copyright to that photo. But people published it all over the place. Why? Because the photo itself was a story. And so under something called fair use, which is an exception to copyright, people can use something. Like, if I was giving you a lecture on the history of photojournalism, right, I might show some really important photos from the history of photojournalism. And because it's education about the photo and a critique of the photo, it probably falls under fair use. Fair use is as nebulous of a concept as they get, and it's very, very complicated. I wouldn't rely on it, but it can come into play in certain circumstances, and that would be one of them. So you would be okay using that photo. Anyway, he's not going to sue you for copyright violation because it'll just drag out the publicity. But, more questions?
Last question?